ULB Podcast. Les podcasts de l'Université libre de Bruxelles.
Talking with you, the student's point of view.
Here to share ideas,
Spark conversations,
and inspire change.
Welcome to our new episode of Talking with You, the podcast where the student's point of view matters. This show provides students with an open and safe space to discuss topics that concerns us, both as students and as passionate young individuals. Hello everyone, my name is Cora and I will be hosting this episode today. Welcome to this month's episode of the Talking with You podcast. Today is a special occasion. We're releasing this episode on International Women's Day, a day to highlight achievements in gender equality while also recognizing the persistent challenges that still need to be addressed. Gender equality is a fundamental value of the European Union, yet inequalities remain in many areas, going from workplace, politics, to the digital world. Of course, gender equality is an issue that requires attention every day, not only on this occasion, but today serves as a powerful reminder to honor and reinforce our commitment to this cause. Recent findings from the European Institute for Gender Equality highlight just how critical this discussion remains. The latest Gender Equality Index 2024, which was released on the 25th of February, underscores that gender-based violence is still widespread. Shockingly, in 2022 alone, 2,300 women were killed by their partner or a family member, and a survey conducted between 2020 and 2024 revealed that 31% of women have experienced physical and or sexual violence after the age of 15. These alarming statistics come at a time of multiple crises in Europe, further deepening existing gender inequalities. And while legislative progress has been made, such as the entry into force of the Istanbul Convention in 2023 and the adoption of the first EU law against gender-based and domestic violence in 2024, the actual implementation of these measures remains inconsistent across member states. So, this will be today's topic, and now let's move to today's guests. Alessia Ruta, first year's master's student in European Studies and writer at EIGE Europe.
Hello, it's so nice to be back.
Welcome back to the podcast. And Andrea Abril Montoya, a first year master's student in European Studies and vice president at SAS.
Hello everyone, thank you for having me, it's a pleasure.
So, I would like to start by addressing the EU's broader commitment to gender equality. As we saw from the European Commission work program for 2025 that came out some weeks ago under the chapter Protecting Our Democracy, Upholding Our Values, the Commission recognizes the historic progress made, such as pay transparency, gender balance on company boards, and work-life balance policies, but also acknowledges that more needs to be done. This is why the Commission has announced a roadmap for women's rights, which will have just came out when our listeners will listen to this episode, in order to reaffirm its commitment to gender equality and the fight against discrimination based on gender, disability, sexual orientation, or race. So from your perspective, and I would maybe like to start with Alessia, what are the most urgent gender equality issues that the EU should prioritize in the coming years?
Well, I always find it difficult to give a straightforward answer to this kind of questions, because most things that are urgent now have been urgent for decades, basically, which is not encouraging. And the rest wouldn't be as concerningly urgent if only institutions had been more intentional and consistent in promoting gender equality and in doing gender mainstreaming across policy sectors. Of course, I'm not saying that there was no improvement over the decades. I acknowledge that I was born with rights that my grandmothers didn't have at the time they were born, and that I can somewhat count on better career perspectives than my mother, for example. But at the same time, I also acknowledge that if institutions and we all as a society don't put greater efforts into safeguarding existing rights, and if we don't become more ambitious in achieving even more encompassing rights, well, to use the same metaphor as before, my daughter will be born with less rights than me. And this is not what progress, and particularly human rights-based progress, looks like. To make a more concrete example, I would say that sexual and reproductive rights should be a priority of the public discourse that in many member states, such as Italy, where I'm from, still approaches the topic in a shy and biased way, to say the least, and a priority of institutions, of course. This is because we are essentially back at fighting for bodily autonomy and the possibility to independently decide on things like getting an abortion. At the current state, we know that the EU cannot directly make the right to abortion a universal thing in all member states, but it can surely use other means to help advancing the recognition of such right by member states and its enjoyment by people who can get pregnant. Let's take the My Voice, My Choice Citizens initiative as a reference, as it's promoting to essentially use economic means, financial means, to get there, which is a stratagem we are kind of used to in the whole EU system. Secondly, I would prioritize a change in perspective when it comes to the advancement of gender equality, even within the bodies of the EU itself, where women are still underrepresented. There is a very interesting academic paper by Chappell and Guerrina that explains this point very well, with particular reference to the European External Action Service. The authors argue that, and I quote, "The neoliberal foundations of the EU permeate the way the EEAS incorporates the principle of equality along the lines of the add women and steer principle." What can we comment on this? Well, first thing first, in institutions, in workplaces, anywhere, adding women and steering is not enough, and that's why we should use more ambitious approaches. And secondly, we should also be more ambitious when applying feminism to policies. And here is where I say the magic word, intersectionality. Intersectionality is relevant for advancing women's rights, but not only women's rights, because it gives us the analytical and practical tools to understand that inequalities, disadvantages, insecurities, violence, you name it, are not things that are experienced in the same exact way by all women, because the element of gender produces effects on our lived experiences also in combination with other elements of our personal conditions, such as ethnicity and socioeconomic background. In practice, I'm an Italian woman living in Belgium, and I'm exposed to being a victim of discrimination for being a woman. And in my case, it kind of stops there, because even if living in another country, I still have privileges linked to being white and linked to being an EU citizen. And don't get me started on the whole expat versus migrant label. But if I were a black migrant woman, maybe even from a country facing an armed conflict, so even with the refugee status, I will be facing discrimination for being a woman, for being black, for being a migrant, and for being a refugee. Alongside this, we also have to overcome a binary understanding of gender equality and make policies and any political action so that they ensure the rights and freedoms of any person who does not fit into the cis hetero-allosexual normativity. Once you see all of these nuances, you begin to understand why simply adding women as if we were just quotas, just tokens, is definitely not enough to achieve parity in any field.
Thank you very much, Alessia. And what about you, Andrea?
Yeah, I think Alessia covered the main key points really well. I'll build on that saying that, yeah, it's true that we've seen some important improvements at the political level and the public discourse. Also, we are not obviously in the same situation as we were 30 years ago. On a legislative level, the EU adopted the directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence last year. Of course, since it's a directive, it still needs to be transposed into national law, and while it sets the minimum standards, some members can go further. But this directive was really expected because it addressed some of the most pressing challenges in gender equality. But it fell short of expectations, we can say, for some professionals in the field and some organizations. For instance, we have the biggest one in the field, one of the biggest ones, Women Against Violence Europe. And as they say, come on, we are talking about combating violence against women in 2025. So this directive could have been more ambitious because yet some crucial elements are missing, like for example, the criminalization of rape and the full protection of migrants and undocumented women. But we can find there important things and important points as the inclusion of specific crimes when it comes to the online violence, for example. So while the directive is a step forward, it's not enough. What we need now is a real political commitment at the national level, as Alessia was saying before, to ensure that no woman, regardless of the country she lives in the EU, is left unprotected. Beyond the legal gaps, one of the biggest challenges that we are seeing in the public discourse, for example, and the political sphere, is the resistance to recognizing violence against women and gender issue. There's been a shift towards more gender-neutral policies, which may seem inclusive but often ignores the specific challenge women face because of patriarchal structures.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for your contribution and both for your perspectives on this. So now I'd like to shift a little bit our focus to a specific aspect of gender equality, one that doesn't always get the attention it deserves, I believe, despite of course being incredibly relevant today more than ever, which is cyber violence against women and girls. I recently came across a report by the European Institute for Gender Equality, which proposes a new European measurement framework to assess and combat cyber violence. And one particularly striking finding, although perhaps not really surprising, is that the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights reported that 53% of content published on social media contains hate speech, with women being the primary targets in most countries. So starting from on these figures, my question to you is, why do you think women are the main targets of cyber violence? And considering the rapid expansion of social media and digital technologies, what concrete steps should the EU take to address and to prevent this growing issue? Andrea, would you like to start this time?
Sure, this is a great question actually, because first we need to understand that social media doesn't create gender-based violence in isolation or as a standalone phenomenon. It reproduces and amplifies the harm that already exists in the, let's say, physical world. One of the biggest misconceptions is that as it is not physical violence, it is somehow less harmful, but cyberviolence is gender-based violence and has real-world consequences. For example, according to the European Parliamentary Research Service, the overall cost of cyber-harassment and cyber-stalking in the EU are estimated between 49 and 89 billion euros, and this includes, for example, mental health costs and legal costs. So, answering the big question, what can the EU do? First, we need to understand that cyberviolence is a multifaceted problem and is evolving super fast. So, the rise of artificial intelligence, for example, has made threats even more dangerous, and new forms of harassment appear all the time. Also, social media platforms are neutral spaces. It's important to look at the way they are moderated, if they are moderated. That's why we need to include social media platforms in the conversation, making them accountable of the problem. Another challenge is the fragmentation between member states. You mentioned before the European Institute for Gender Equality, that they have done really important work mapping cyber violence, and they found that there are still major gaps in how different countries define and address the issue. So a common and better EU-wide approach is essential. And finally, education is key. Digital literacy, especially for young people, plays a crucial role in preventing cyber violence. But it is not just about knowing how to stay safe online. It's also about recognizing harmful behavior and making sure we don't reproduce them. Also, it is important to mention one huge benefit from the digital world, and is that it connects an unlimited number of people with the same interests, creating communities, but this can be a double-edged sword. We have the thrive of spaces and communities where misogynistic content is spread, and this can fuel real-world violence. And this is just an online issue. It has direct consequences on women's lives, being silenced, excluded, or forced to live online spaces. And that's exactly what we need to change, so that digital platforms are places of opportunity, not harm.
Thank you very much. What do you think about this, Alessia?
I totally agree with what Andreas just said. And I believe it is easy to fall into the trap of considering digital technologies to be neutral, because at the end of the day, they're all just about codes, numbers, algorithms, right? Well, this is a very narrow and shallow way of approaching any topic that's related to the digital sphere. First and foremost, as Andrea already mentioned, in the digital space, we replicate the social norms and prejudices that we have in the offline world. So, of course, if women are victims of hate speech and violence in the offline world, they automatically are online too. In addition to that, not only the use we make of digital technologies can have such a gendered impact, but the same applies to the development of said digital technologies to begin with. Let's take artificial intelligence, for example. Artificial intelligence is trained on the basis of the knowledge that we produce as individuals in a society that has certain values, stereotypes, and biases. So to make it more simple, AI can amplify inequalities if trained on biased data. This translates into effects like stereotypical representations in images created through generative AI, but also to more serious consequences that could especially impact women's health. I remember that a while ago, I was attending a conference in Padova where one of the speakers mentioned that applying AI in healthcare poses threats to women's health. And do you want to guess why? Well, that's because the data that is used to train the AI is mostly based on symptoms of male patients. And this leads to overlooking symptoms in women, misdiagnosis, and inadequate treatment for female patients. Everything I just said is also a part of the bigger picture of the problem of lacking a gender-based approach to medicine, but I don't want to move away from the main topic of the question. So back to violence. I have to say, I agree also on Andrea's last point about education. And if I may add, young people do not only need digital literacy to learn some etiquette, but also comprehensive, precise, and inclusive sex education, with the aim of raising awareness on concepts such as consent, and also on the healthy exploration of one's feelings and one's sexuality, which should ultimately enable us as a society to prevent gender-based violence, both online and offline. Apart from the individual's relational, emotional, and sexual sphere that we have covered so far. This is a discourse that also touches upon political matters and the participation of women in politics. There are some reports, including those by the UN Secretary General that are published annually, highlighting that women in politics, as well as female activists and women peace builders, face even higher risks of discrimination, violence, and online hate speech than their male counterparts for their political or advocacy activity. So my ultimate take on this is that we should even just stop making such distinctions about online world and offline world, violences that happen online and violences that happen offline. Maybe it made sense in the first decades when internet was a brand new thing, but now our daily offline activities, we want to call them as such, are intertwined with the digital world. We use digital tools all the time, even in an offline setting. And on the other hand, our actions in the digital world on social media platforms have concrete, tangible effects in our daily offline life. And lastly, when it comes to regulations, after everything that we've been witnessing recently with the management of X, formerly Twitter, and Meta, we can conclude that we cannot leave the responsibility of regulating content and hate speech to the good heart, when it happens to be a good heart, of private company. So further public intervention, in my opinion, is needed to ensure online safety. So to conclude, here is a thought-provoking question for you. Who takes care of safety, of security in, again, the so-called offline world? And how would we feel if our safety while talking in a public square was delegated to private actors the same as it is in digital spaces?
If our listeners want to drop some answers or some thoughts on this on our social medias, we would be very curious to read your answers. So thank you very much to both of you for joining us in this episode, and to our listeners, as always.
Bye, thank you for having us.
Bye-bye. Thank you again for having me, and have a great International Women's Day. May this be a day of celebration of all that has been achieved, of remembrance of our sisters, and a day of fierce claim of all of the rights that are still there to be taken.
That brings us to the end of this episode of Talking with You, where the student's point of view truly matters. Don't forget to follow us for more discussions on the topics shaping Europe today. This podcast was sponsored by the Institut d'études européennes of the Université Libre de Bruxelles, which we thank for the opportunity of this space.